The entire restaurant went silent the moment he walked in. Not the polite kind of quiet that falls over a room when someone important arrives. Something deeper, instinctive, like the stillness that settles just before a storm changes direction. Kai-sung moved through the dining room of Bellini's like a man who had never once in his life asked for permission. Dark navy suit. No tie. A tattoo climbing the left side of his neck. Eyes that swept every corner of the room before he'd even reached his table. At 29, he controlled more of Philadelphia's underworld than most people knew existed. He didn't run drugs. He didn't rob banks. He moved power. He moved silence. And when silence wasn't enough, he moved people out of the way. But tonight, according to his associate Vincent Mara, was different. Tonight was a blind date. What Vincent hadn't mentioned, what none of the three men watching from across the bar had mentioned, was the truth. The woman waiting by the window couldn't hear a single word Kai would say. To them, it was the perfect prank. A powerful man. A deaf woman. An awkward disaster waiting to happen. They had absolutely no idea what was actually about to unfold. If stories like this move you, hit subscribe before we go any further. And drop a comment. Have you ever completely misjudged someone? Tell me below. Now let's get into it. She was already there when he arrived. Tucked into a curved leather booth near the window, a young woman sat alone in the warm amber glow of a candle flickering inside a short glass holder. She wore a soft ivory wrap dress that complemented her deep brown skin beautifully. Her natural hair was pinned up with a few loose coils falling around her face, and her hands rested quietly on the white tablecloth as she watched the candlelight the way most people watch something they find genuinely beautiful, with patience, without distraction. Her name was Zara Calloway. She was 22 years old. She taught at the Whitmore School for the Deaf on the west side of Philadelphia. A job she had taken 2 years earlier and immediately understood was exactly where she was supposed to be. She loved watercolor painting, early morning runs through Fairmount Park, and the way autumn turned the trees along the Schuylkill River into walls of gold and amber. She had not heard a single sound since she was 4 years old. She had come tonight because a profile on a dating app had told her she'd be meeting a successful businessman who admired her work with children. The profile had been warm, thoughtful, surprisingly detailed. It had asked about her students, her classroom, what she found most rewarding about teaching kids who the world had so often overlooked. It had felt genuine. And Zara, who had spent her whole life learning to read people with precision, had allowed herself something close to cautious hope. She did not know the profile was fake. She did not know that the man about to walk through those restaurant doors had been sent here as the unwitting target of a joke. And she had no idea that the three men currently watching her from a table near the bar, Vincent Mara, Polly Greco, and a third man called Saluka, had been engineering this evening like a performance. They had found Zara through the app, matched with her using a false identity, and arranged the date with one specific intention, watching it collapse in real time. The plan was clean in its cruelty. Kai would sit down. He would try to speak to a woman who couldn't hear him. She would stare back, unable to follow. The confusion would mount. The frustration would surface. And the most feared man in Philadelphia, a man who commanded rooms just by entering them, would be rendered completely helpless by a quiet, simple misunderstanding. To Vincent, to Polly, to Saluka, it was flawless. The kind of prank that gets retold for years over drinks. They had their seats. They had their ringside view. And now, as Kai-sung crossed the restaurant floor and the room stilled around him, they leaned forward with barely contained laughter, waiting for the beautiful disaster to begin. They were about to make a catastrophic. Kai reached the booth and stopped. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. For one suspended moment, they simply regarded each other, the sharp-eyed young man in the navy suit and the quietly composed woman in the candlelight. And the noise of the restaurant seemed to press close around them the way sound always does just before something important shifts. Zara's eyes were a rich, deep brown, warm and steady and absolutely unintimidated. They held his gaze without flinching, with the particular calm that belongs to people who have spent their entire lives reading the world through sight alone. She had learned long ago that a person's face tells you everything their voice tries to hide. In those first 3 seconds, she read Kai-sung the way a musician reads sheet music, quickly, completely, and with an instinct that ran deeper than thought. She smiled. Careful, genuine. A greeting offered without certainty of how it would land. and then she raised her hands. Her fingers moved with quiet, unhurried grace. Each gesture precise. Each word shaped with the confidence of someone for whom this was not a second language, but a first. The language she had grown up inside. The language she thought and dreamed in. Asterisk, hi. I'm Zara. Thank you for meeting me. Asterisk. At the bar, Vincent Mara set down his glass. Polly Greco stopped mid-sentence. All three of them leaned forward, bright-eyed, waiting for the confusion to spread across Kai's face. Waiting for the performance to begin. What they saw instead stopped all three of them completely cold. Kai stood perfectly still. His expression didn't shift, not into confusion, not into irritation, not into the helpless discomfort they had been counting on. He held her gaze for a long, unreadable moment. The kind of stillness that belongs to someone deciding how much of themselves to show. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands. His fingers moved with a fluency that made the nearby waiter pause mid-step. Not fumbling. Not approximating. Not the halting, self-conscious gestures of someone working from memory of a YouTube tutorial. His hands moved with the deep, settled ease of muscle memory, the kind that only comes from years. From necessity. From love. Asterisk, it's really nice to meet you, Zara. I'm Kai. Mind if I sit down? Asterisk. Zara's lips parted slightly. Her eyes widened. And then she smiled. Not the careful, measured smile from a moment ago, but something entirely different. Something surprised and real, and, above everything else, deeply relieved. At the bar, Vincent's drink never reached his lips. Polly blinked twice. Saluka leaned back slowly in his chair and said a single word under his breath that none of them would repeat later. The joke was over. And something else, something none of them could have planned for, something none of them had any framework to understand, had already begun. Kai sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them signed anything. They simply looked at each other in the candlelight, and the restaurant noise seemed to fall back, to grant the table its distance, as though the room itself understood that what was unfolding here required a different kind of attention. Then Zara tilted her head, a small curious gesture, and her hands rose. Asterisk, you signed beautifully. Most hearing people don't. Asterisk. Kai's jaw tightened just barely. A movement so small that only someone trained in reading faces would have noticed. Zara noticed. She noticed everything. I had a good teacher, he signed back. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. That was the first thing he noticed about her. The way she understood that silence could be a complete sentence. They ordered dinner in a quiet choreography of pointed fingers and patient cooperation, with the waiter earning every cent of his tip. Over bruschetta and a shared plate of burrata, their conversation unfolded entirely without sound. Hands moving through the candlelit air between them like something practiced and natural, something that had no right to feel this effortless between two people who had been strangers an hour ago. Tell me something about you that no one else in this restaurant would guess, Zara signed. Kai studied her face. Then, I haven't signed with anyone in 4 years. Zara's expression shifted. Not to pity. To something closer to recognition. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what it feels like to carry something in silence. Why did you stop? His hand stayed still on the table. The candle flame rose and dipped between them. Then, carefully, as though the words themselves were made of something fragile, I lost the person I used to sign with. Zara held his gaze. She didn't sign I'm sorry. She didn't offer gentle reassurances or reach for the comfortable words people use when they don't know what else to do. Instead, she signed something that stopped him completely still. Then I'm glad your hands still remember. Kai Sung had faced things that would have broken most men his age. He had stared down people twice his size in rooms with no witnesses. He had received calls at 2 a.m. that required nothing but a steady voice and a clear head. He had built himself, deliberately and without sentiment, into something hard and controlled and unreachable. But sitting across from this woman, watching her say something so simple and so precisely kind, he felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent 4 years carefully sealing shut. Before we go any further, if this story is already getting to you, hit that subscribe button right now. There are thousands of stories like this one waiting for you. And drop a comment. What's the most unexpected kindness a stranger has ever shown you? I read every single one. Now let's talk about why Kai Sung knew sign language at all. Because the answer will break your heart. Her name was Sua. Sua Sung. Born 13 months after Kai in a narrow row house in South Philadelphia. in the kind of neighborhood where every family carried a story they didn't discuss with outsiders. Their father had come from Busan with nothing but a work visa, a contact name, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that failing is simply not an option. Their mother had grown up in the Kensington neighborhood 4 blocks over. Irish-American, sharp-tongued, ferociously loving in the way that people are when love is the one resource they have in surplus. Suah had their mother's pale skin and their father's dark eyes. She was small and quick, and she laughed at everything. Or she would have, if she had been able to hear the joke. Suah had been profoundly deaf since birth. In a household that communicated almost entirely at volume, she moved through a world of perfect stillness. Kai had learned sign language before he could reliably tie his shoes. Nobody taught him. Nobody enrolled him in a class or handed him a workbook or sat him down with a structured plan. He learned it the way children learn the things that matter most, urgently, organically, out of pure need. Because Suah was his best friend, his shadow, his person, and if he wanted to tell her about his day, or warn her that their father was tired and irritable, or ask her what she was drawing in the margins of her homework, he had to speak her language. So he did. By the time he was 9, he was fluent. By the time he was 13, he was her interpreter at school meetings and medical appointments and the parent-teacher conferences their father attended silently, and their mother attended loudly, and neither of them translated adequately. Kai stood in those rooms and spoke for his sister with the particular fierce protectiveness of an older sibling who has decided that the world's negligence is a personal offense. And Suah gave him, in return, the only version of peace he knew. When the house got too loud, when the pressure of being the oldest child of an immigrant father with enormous expectations got too heavy, Kai would find Suah in her room, and they would sign to each other about nothing. About the cats that lived on the back fence. About what they would do when they were older and had their own apartments and didn't have to share one bathroom with 4 people. She wanted to be a graphic designer. She filled every available surface with drawings, intricate, detailed, obsessively neat. Kai used to sit on the edge of her bed and watch her work and think that she was the most talented person he would ever know. He built everything that came later. The network, the reputation, the controlled and deliberate empire of a man who had learned young that power was the only reliable protection, partly out of necessity and partly out of a promise he had made himself at age 12. That Suah would always be safe. That Suah would always have what she needed. That nobody would ever overlook his sister while Kai Sung was breathing. He kept that promise until the night he couldn't.
Kai received the call in the back of a black car on a wet November night. He had just concluded a meeting that had required 3 weeks of careful positioning and left 2 of his most senior associates looking visibly relieved to be walking out with their arrangements intact. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. He answered. He listened to a voice tell him, in the flattened, practiced tone of someone trained to deliver the worst news in the most clinical way possible, that there had been an accident on the I-76. A driver who ran a red light. A rainy night. Suah's car. She had never seen the headlights. She had never heard the horn. She was 25 years old. Kai ended the call. He placed the phone in his jacket pocket. He looked out the rain-streaked window at the Philadelphia night, and he said nothing. His driver, who had worked for him for 4 years and understood that Kai's silences had different textures, and this one was unlike any he had encountered before, did not speak. At the hospital, Kai sat in the parking garage for 38 minutes. He knew later, thinking about it, that it was irrational. He knew that time had already passed, that the outcome had already been determined, that his presence or absence in that parking garage changed nothing. But some part of him, the part that was still the 9-year-old boy signing "Stay close to me" to his little sister on a crowded street corner, operated on a different logic. The logic that said, as long as you stay in the car, as long as you don't walk through those doors, it is still the version of tonight where she is alive. Eventually he went inside. Afterward, he went home, and he locked away everything that had belonged to the language he and Suah had shared. Not the objects, there were few, but the reflex, the instinct, the way his hands had always known, without thinking, exactly how to reach for her. He shut it down the way you close off a room in a house you can't sell, but can't bear to enter. For 4 years, Kai Sung did not sign a single word to a single living person. What he did not allow himself to understand was that sealing the language away was also sealing away the part of himself that Suah had loved most. The patient part. The gentle part. The part that had always known, without needing to be told, that the most powerful thing you can do for another person is learn to speak their language. That part of him had been dormant for 4 years. Until a young woman in an ivory dress raised her hands in a candlelit restaurant and signed, "Hello, I'm Zara," and something inside Kai Sung recognized her immediately. Not as a stranger, not as a prank, as a doorway back into the room he had sealed shut.
They left Bellini's just after 10. The October air met them at the door, clean and sharp, carrying the smell of wet pavement and someone's chimney smoke drifting from a side street. The city moved around them at its Friday night pace, indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had just happened inside that restaurant. Walnut Street glittered under amber street lights, and the trees lining the sidewalk held their last red leaves like they were reluctant to let go. Kai held the door open. Zara stepped through it and out into the night, and as she passed him she tilted her face up and signed, "Thank you for tonight. Thank you for reminding me." He signed back. She tilted her head, that small, curious gesture he was already beginning to recognize as distinctly hers. "Reminding you of what?" He paused. His hands stayed at his sides for a moment, and then he lifted them and signed carefully, as though testing whether the shape of the words still fit inside his palms, "that this language still lives inside me." She looked at him for a long moment without signing anything at all. Then she gave a single, quiet nod, the kind that says, "I understand more than you just said." They walked together through the October night. 3 blocks, side by side, without a single sign passing between them. Just walking. The sound of their footsteps against the pavement. The kind of silence that isn't empty, that has warmth to it, substance, the particular quality of something shared rather than avoided. At the corner of 18th and Spruce, Zara stopped. She turned to face him beneath the street light, and in its warm orange glow her face was completely open. No performance, no careful positioning, no armor. Just the face of a young woman who had spent an evening being fully, unhurriedly seen, possibly for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. "I had a really wonderful time," she signed. "So did I," Kai signed back. She smiled. Then she reached into her bag and drew out a small card. Cream-colored, simple. Her name, her email, the address of the Whitmore School. She held it out. "If you ever want to talk again, you know where to find me." Kai took the card. He held it with a care that was subtle but unmistakable. The way you handle something you already know matters, even before you've had time to fully understand why. Zara turned and walked to the corner where her rideshare was already waiting at the curb. She got into the back seat. She looked through the window, raised one hand in a small, easy wave, and then the car pulled into traffic and disappeared. Kai stood on the sidewalk alone. He looked at the card. He thought about Suwa. And for the first time in 4 years, the thought didn't arrive with the crushing, airless weight of guilt that had followed it every time before. It came instead with something quieter, something warmer, something that felt, if he was honest with himself about it, a little bit like permission. 3 days later, Kai Sung walked through the front doors of the Whitmore School for the Deaf. He told no one where he was going. Not Vincent, not Polly, not Saluka. Not a single person in his organization knew that the man who quietly controlled half of Philadelphia's criminal infrastructure was standing in the lobby of a school for deaf children on a Wednesday morning, wearing a charcoal crewneck sweater and holding a white bakery box from a Korean patisserie on Broad Street. Honey pastries and walnut cakes. The kind his mother used to set out on Sunday mornings when she was trying to say something with food that she couldn't quite say with words. He had considered calling ahead. He had spent approximately 45 seconds considering it before deciding that calling ahead was a way of giving himself the option to retreat, and he had spent 4 years retreating from things that mattered. Zara saw him from the end of the hallway. She stopped. A half-second of stillness, genuine surprise moving across her face before she had time to compose it. And then she broke into the kind of smile that makes everything in its vicinity seem a little less heavy. She walked toward him with the open, unhurried ease of someone genuinely glad to see another person, and that uncomplicated gladness, the absence of any agenda behind it, hit Kai somewhere he hadn't expected. "You came," she signed. "You invited me," he signed back. She gave him a full tour. The classrooms with their bright finger-spelling charts and photographs of students pinned to every wall. The art studio where half-finished paintings dried on wire racks. The small library she had built almost entirely from donated books, organized with meticulous care. The playground, where a few children were still finishing their lunch in the cold November sunlight, chasing each other in the wordless, joyful way that children do everywhere. She introduced him to her students. A dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10, all of whom looked up at this tall, quiet young man with the wide-open curiosity that belongs only to children and people who have decided that pretending simply costs too much. One girl, tiny, 6 years old, with enormous dark eyes and 2 missing front teeth, and a barrette shaped like a sunflower that was sliding slowly out of her hair, grabbed Kai's sleeve and signed up at him without preamble. "Are you Zara's boyfriend?" Kai looked down at her. He lowered himself to one knee so that they were level, and he signed back with complete seriousness. "I'm her friend." The girl, her name was Rosie, examined his face with the gravity of someone conducting an official investigation. Then she signed, "You have sad eyes. But they're nice sad eyes." Kai blinked. Behind him, Zara turned away and pressed her hand to her mouth. And something inside Kai sung, something that had been armored for years, something he had constructed so carefully and maintained so deliberately that it had started to feel like a permanent part of his architecture, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough to let a different kind of light find its angle. He came back the next week. And the week after that. Gave him back. He came without announcement, without expectation, without any need to be received as anything other than what he was in this particular building. Just a person who showed up. Each time he brought something. Pastries. Art supplies. New books for the library, chosen carefully, bold, colorful, full of characters who looked like the children in the room. He set things down quietly and let them be found. He never asked for acknowledgement. He simply sat in Zara's classroom and signed with the children, and the children, with the flawless instinct kids have for detecting genuine warmth beneath a quiet exterior, adopted him immediately and without ceremony. They climbed on him. They corrected his finger spelling. They competed ferociously for his attention in the way children do when they've decided someone is worth impressing. He let a boy named Deshaun beat him at checkers 3 times in a row and responded with such exaggerated disbelief that the whole class shook with silent laughter. And each afternoon, after the children went home and the hallways settled into their quiet end-of-day hush, Kai and Zara would sit together in her classroom, 2 chairs angled toward each other, the late afternoon light coming through the windows gold and long, and sign about things that neither of them discussed with anyone else. She told him about growing up deaf in a hearing family in North Philadelphia, about being the only deaf person at every dinner table, every birthday party, every family gathering, about the exhaustion of spending every waking hour translating a world that hadn't been designed with her in mind, about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who loved you and still feeling, somehow, like you were watching everything from the other side of a window. "I know," he signed. She looked at him. Really looked. "You do, don't you?" "More than you'd believe," he signed back. He told her about Suwa, about the row house and the drawings and the back fence cats, about being 13 and standing in school board meetings translating for a sister who deserved a translator who never got tired and never got it wrong, about the hospital parking garage and the 38 minutes. Zara's eyes were bright when he finished. She didn't wipe them. She signed. "She sounds like someone the world didn't deserve to lose." She was, Kai signed. She really was. No wisdom after that. No attempt to repair or reframe. Zara simply received it. The way a person who truly knows how to listen receives things, and let the words exist between them whole and undiminished. Kai walked to his car that evening feeling lighter than he had in years. Not fixed. Not resolved. Just lighter. Like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed too long. But the moment that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in early November, and Kai knew something was wrong the moment he stepped through the classroom door. The usual warmth of the room, the movement, the laughter, the contained and happy energy of children who feel genuinely safe, was gone. In its place was a specific kind of tension that Kai recognized from rooms of a very different kind. The tension of a space where something bad had recently happened and hadn't finished happening yet. Zara was kneeling in the corner by the window. In front of her, curled against the wall with his knees pulled up to his chest and his face buried in his arms, was a small boy. Marcus. The boy Zara had told Kai about weeks ago, during one of their late afternoon conversations when the classroom had gone quiet and the light had gone gold. The boy who had been completely nonverbal for 2 full years. The boy who, on an unremarkable afternoon in the art room, had looked up at a painting Zara had hung on the wall and signed the word beautiful, and in doing so, had unlocked something in himself that every person who cared about him had been holding their breath waiting for. Marcus was shaking. Zara was signing to him gently, her hands slow and patient and precise. But Marcus's face was buried. He wouldn't look up. He wouldn't look at anyone. Kai crossed the room without hesitation and crouched beside her. She looked at him, and in that single glance he saw the thing he knew immediately, the helplessness that comes from loving someone and not being able to reach them. He had sat with that helplessness in a hospital parking garage. He knew its exact weight. What happened? Older boys during recess, she signed. They were mocking his signing, called him broken. Kai's expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on his knees, closed slowly into fists. He looked at Marcus, this small boy making himself as small as possible, trying to disappear, trying to become invisible in a world that had just handed him the cruelest possible verdict. You don't belong here. You are wrong. You are broken. And Kai saw, with a clarity that arrived without warning and hit with the force of something long compressed, exactly who he was looking at. He was looking at himself, 9 years old, learning a language nobody around him spoke, standing in rooms between his sister and a world that couldn't be bothered to accommodate her, deciding, without anyone ever telling him it was his job, that he would be the one to close that gap. He reached out and touched Marcus gently on the shoulder. Marcus flinched. Then, slowly, the way trust moves when it has been recently injured, he raised his head. His face was streaked with tears. His eyes were red and swollen. He looked at Kai with the expression of a child who has started to wonder if the world's verdict might actually be correct. Kai signed slowly, clearly, each word shaped with absolute care and with everything he had. You are not broken. The people who said that are the broken ones. You speak a language that most people will never be brave enough to learn. That doesn't make you less. That makes you extraordinary. Marcus stared at him. His small hands trembled. Then he signed one word. Really? Kai nodded. Really? Marcus held his gaze for a long, searching moment. And then, with the sudden, wholehearted trust that children extend to the people they have decided to believe, he leaned forward and wrapped both arms around Kai's neck. Kai closed his eyes. He held the boy, his hands pressed against Marcus's small back, and he felt the shaking slowly, go still. Across the classroom, Zara Calloway watched the most feared man in Philadelphia kneel on a school floor and hold a crying child like it was the most natural thing he had ever done. And she understood something in that moment that no one else in Kai's life would ever fully know. Not the men who feared him, not the men who followed him, not the people who had built entire mythologies around who he was. She understood that the part of him everyone had missed, the part that Suwa had always seen, the part he had sealed away in a hospital parking garage on a rainy November night, had never actually been gone. It had just been waiting, all this time, for someone to speak its language. Clapperboard conclusion. They never gave it a name for a long time. Kai kept coming to the school. Zara kept sitting with him in the quiet of her empty classroom after hours, their hands moving through the air between them, carrying the kinds of conversations that don't survive translation into sound. The children at Whitmore stopped noticing his arrivals and started expecting them, which is the highest honor a classroom full of children can bestow. Marcus learned to sign his full name with his chin up and his hands steady. He taught Kai a new sign he'd invented himself, a private one, just between the two of them, and made Kai promise not to teach it to anyone else. Kai promised. And Kai sung. The man who had built an empire out of controlled silence and deliberate power, who had sealed away the most essential part of himself because the grief of using it alone was too much to carry, learned something he had always known and spent 4 years forcing himself to forget, that the bravest thing a person can do is reach towards someone else in a language they were afraid they had lost forever. He thought about Suwa often. He still does. But the thoughts came differently now. Not like pressure against a sealed door. Not like water rising in a closed room. They came the way good memories are supposed to come, gently, with gratitude, with the quiet grace of something you loved and were lucky, even briefly, to have. On the small cream card still kept in the drawer of his nightstand, Zara Calloway, Whitmore School for the Deaf, he had written 4 words in the margin in his own handwriting. She was right. Still remember, if this story moved you, Please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about unexpected grace and the people brave enough to carry it. Leave a comment below and tell me, what does this story mean to you? I'll see you in the next one.